So video games today are a little wacky in a lot of different ways, but one thing that's always been odd to me is that the majority of titles are advertised exclusively to men under 20 years old, which seems to be business as usual for this medium, but that should be really freaking weird. Like, take a second and imagine a world where books are only made for teenage girls, movies are only made for women over 40, and the latest Kanye West album is advertised exclusively to men over 80 years old. That would be absolutely bonkers and there'd be riots in the streets. But take a second to look at our real world, where we have a budding art form that has a combination of movies, music, and literature, and bam, it's only for non-boomer dudes. Why? Because theoretically, there are millions of potential customers the gaming industry is just completely ignoring by using this tactic. And if literally every other art form in human existence is advertised to all ages, in all genders, why isn't gaming for everyone? Well, the truth is, it was. Back in the days of Pong and Atari, there were advertisements of a grandma teaching her grandson how to play a game about shooting robots by showing him herself, and various commercials of a mom defending her family by playing asteroids. But nowadays, there seems to be no high-budget video games advertised to your parents. And in that hypothetical scenario, where your mom and dad don't care about social norms, and they aren't scared away by the claims of video games making them a Fortnite-addicted sociopath, when your parents pick up a game nowadays, they will simply stare at the ceiling and walk into walls. So what changed from then to now? What changed to make video games seemingly inaccessible to anyone outside this narrow demographic here? Well, to answer all of that, we're gonna have to jump through a short history lesson, look into the half-truths of game violence, and dabble a little bit in my favorite topic of game literacy. Our story begins in the ancient year of 1975, where one of the first video game consoles, Home Pong, was released by an American company by the name of Atari. This version of Pong and sequential home releases were advertised to the masses in Sears magazine as a game for the entire American family to enjoy. And as you may know, Home Pong was a major success and became a household name. So Atari used this successful gaming is for everyone marketing for their next console, the Atari 2600. And as I previously mentioned, Atari kept advertising their consoles to every member of the American family, including the dog, I guess. Yet Atari made one fatal flaw, which brought us to where we are today. The marketing team at Atari wanted to spread the message that their new console could play a variety of games, which is very hard to do when you don't have a variety of games on your console. So they contacted countless third-party developers to get as many games onto their console, seemingly over anything else. And this strategy was successful for a time, and for that time, Atari was the sole king of the gaming world. However, store shelves were soon crowded with broken and buggy titles that were rushed out the door to meet with tight deadlines that were enforced with movie tie-ins. Without the internet, buying games became a gamble of whether or not you'd get anything functional. Sort of like the modern equivalent of buying any EA game, but without the patches. The most infamous of these games was E.T., a game created in just 5 weeks in order to release right before the holiday season. That game had such a negative reception that hundreds of returned copies were dumped in a landfill in New Mexico in an event called the Atari Video Game Burial. Because of a constant stream of titles like E.T., the gaming industry crashed, with revenue falling 97% in just 2 years. And to most Americans, this fad of video games was dead. Atari had literally dug the grave of an industry they created. However, in Japan, the great land of anime, there was hope. Fortunately, due to countless complications, the Atari 2600 did not launch in Japan until after the video game crash of 1983. And with no Atari in Japan, there was no game crash in Japan. Instead, a growing variety company called Nintendo released the Nintendo Family Computer, which was unsurprisingly advertised for the entire family, just like the Atari 2600. The console sold 19 million units in Japan alone, So, Nintendo decided to go global and advertise their new console to America, only to find that not a single retailer would sell the thing. In order to sell their console to a society that no longer trusted game developers, Nintendo had to make a few changes on how video games were presented to an American audience. So over 2 years, Nintendo made 3 small changes to their console, which would change the course of gaming's history for decades to come. First, Nintendo started their very own quality control system. So no video games could get onto Nintendo's console if it was unfinished or buggy. Secondly, Nintendo had to present gaming in a different way, so American retailers would give them a chance. Since no one was buying video games in America, Nintendo advertised their console as a toy, and then they had to make the fateful decision of putting the Nintendo family computer in the boys' toy aisle or the girls' toy aisle. You can probably guess what they chose. Once they decided on their American demographic of boys under 10, Nintendo attacked that market in their advertising aggressively. Finally, to reinforce this change to retailers, Nintendo changed the name of their family computer from the Nintendo Family Computer to the Nintendo Entertainment System, because according to Nintendo, gaming was no longer for the whole family. All these changes brought Nintendo success, and their family computer sold more in the US than in Japan. So, Nintendo adopted the boys' toy marketing strategy worldwide, and started to make video games with that demographic specifically in mind. Since Nintendo was the most successful gaming company in the world at the time, they set the precedent for what video games were after the crash. They were simply toys for boys. Now, it was no longer socially acceptable for anyone over the age of 10 to play with these video games. And this created a generational gap which exists to this very day, which is why your parents probably loved playing Pong and Pac-Man, but haven't picked up a controller since. According to my wonderful Psychology Geek YouTube friend, Daryl Talks Games, who makes all sorts of cool videos on how games and psychology correlate, this ever so wonderful separation makes it far easier for older generations to criticize these increasingly complex video games, due to something called in and out group psychology. This set the stage for waves upon waves of negative press regarding video games from the 80s all the way to our modern day today, with supposed links to violence that continue to scare people away from this medium. But if you actually take the time to look into these claims of video games leading to increased aggression, priming for violent behavior, and desensitization to violence, you will find that the proof for all these claims is all over the place. For every 10 studies you find finally proving a link between video games and violence, you'll find 10 other studies supposedly disproving that same exact link between video games and violence. For example, the Dartmouth College of New Hampshire studied several thousand children and determined that there is a, quote, relatively small but statistically reliable link to video games and increased aggression. But just 4 months later, the University of Oxford also studied several thousand children in nearly the same way and found that there was no link to violent video games and increased aggression in children. In the scientific method, the experiments you create have to produce consistent results after hundreds upon thousands of identical tests in order to become a scientific theory. The problem with most of the discourse surrounding game violence is that in testing there are hundreds of other factors that can affect a person's life aside from video games. And because of that, it's hard to find any significant and consistent link between video games and violent behavior. Now, I want to stress that I am not an expert or professional on this topic, but I do think it is important to note that the professionals and experts on this topic in the United States Supreme Court declared that the psychological research linking video games and youth violence was, quote, unpersuasive in Brown versus the Entertainment Merchants Association. That case was back in 2011, but video games haven't been put in the US Supreme Court since then. At the end of the day, regardless of who believes what with psychology, violent crime by youth has fallen drastically since the 80s, being 20% of what it once was, and is nearly an all-time low. Now, of course, there are thousands of other factors at play here, but my guess is that video games won't make you or your parents violent sociopaths, even if you play as them in certain video games. Regardless, I encourage any of you watching to do your own research, but when you do, make sure to look at both sides of the "do video games cause violence" question. Now, the constant discussion of this topic died down a bit after its initial rise in the 80s, but came back in full force with a wave of violent M-rated games being released throughout the 2000s. In my eyes, this seemed like a generation of game developers who grew up on their original Nintendos, telling their parents, "See, Mom, video games are for adults too, okay?" On the bright side, the surge of M-rated games made it more socially acceptable for any guy up to their 20-somethings to keep on playing these video games, reaching back to the demographic of players who stopped playing the Nintendo games once they turned 10 years old. This expansion into a new demographic seemed to make overall video game sales revenue increase, and one would think you could repeat this behavior with young girls, women over 40, and men over 80 and get the same results. More people playing video games equals more money. Simple math. Yet the problem is that over the years, video games have become far more complex than what they used to be, with ideas like saving, loading, inventories, quests, and moving in a 3D space all becoming so commonplace that game developers don't teach them anymore. I've mentioned this before, but if you were to pick up any book today, like Harry Potter, it would not teach you how to read. It would just assume that you were literate in the English language and knew what letters, words, sentences, and more were before you even picked up the book. Modern video games are the same way. They assume you are literate in gaming's language. The big difference between video games and books is that video games give you feedback. If I stare at Harry Potter for long enough, it's not going to teach me how to read. But if I started up a video game like Rocket League here, I could spend hours on hours mashing all sorts of different button combinations to eventually find the right combination of buttons which allows me to win the match. I use this example because this is exactly what my 2-year-old nephew did over Christmas break. My theory is that many of us millennial or Gen Z dudes learned to be literate in gaming's language through hours upon hours of trial and error when we were younger. But nowadays, if someone who hasn't grown up with video games attempts to play them, they'll likely quit in the first 10 minutes out of frustration, leaving them with a negative experience and a negative impression on video games, which further adds to the negative emotions towards video games by the media. Now, if you wanted to learn how to read, you would start by reading phonics books, which teach you the basics of letters, words, sentences, and more concepts you need to know in order to read a book like Harry Potter. However, currently, or at least as far as I'm aware, the video game industry has no professionally made phonics book style video games. So as some of you may know, I've taken it upon myself to create one of the first phonics book style video games, and I have a video all about it linked probably over here somewhere. So this final problem with game literacy isn't solved quite yet. But if you want to help your parents or a loved one learn how to play video games, share some of the information in this video with them. And feel free to check out the video about my free phonics book style video game right here. It may be a very difficult challenge because of all these negative associations, but hopefully you can convince your loved ones to give video games another chance, so they can learn to love this art form like we do. Thanks for watching, everybody, and as always, have a wonderful day, and I will catch you all next time.